Before we embark on this incredible journey together, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Your stories and support mean the world to us. Now, let's dive into something that will change how you see faith forever. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m., cutting through the silence of my bedroom like a knife through my soul. In 38 years of life, I'd learned that calls at this hour never brought good news. My name is Marcus, and I thought I'd heard every story imaginable working as a counselor in our small Tennessee town. I was wrong. Marcus! The voice was barely a whisper, trembling with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. It was Sarah, my longtime friend from church. We'd known each other since childhood, growing up in the same neighborhood, sharing the same Sunday school classes. Sarah? What's wrong? Are you hurt? I sat up immediately, my heart already racing. In all the years I'd known her, Sarah had never called me this late. She was the type of person who apologized for bothering others during daylight hours. I need to see you. Right now. Something happened, Marcus. Something I can't explain over the phone. Her voice carried a weight I'd never heard before. Not just fear, but complete bewilderment, as if the very foundation of her reality had shifted. Of course. Where are you? I'm sitting in my car outside the all-night diner on Highway 9. I couldn't stay in the house. I couldn't... Her voice broke, and I heard what sounded like a sob being forcefully suppressed. I threw on clothes without thinking, grabbed my keys, and drove through the empty streets of our small town. The streetlights cast long shadows that seemed to dance with an otherworldly quality, as if even the night itself sensed something extraordinary had occurred. When I arrived at the diner, I found Sarah sitting in her old Honda, staring straight ahead, with eyes that looked like they'd witnessed something beyond human comprehension. Her usually neat brown hair was disheveled, and her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. I tapped gently on her window. She turned toward me, and what I saw in her face made my blood run cold. This wasn't just fear or sadness. This was the look of someone whose entire understanding of the world had been shattered in a single night. We went inside the nearly empty diner and slid into a corner booth. Sarah ordered coffee with shaking hands, though I doubted she needed any more stimulation. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow that made her pale complexion appear almost ghostly. "Marcus," she began, her voice barely audible above the coffee maker's gurgling, "what I'm about to tell you, you're going to think I've lost my mind, but I swear on my mother's grave, every word is true." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "Sarah, we've been friends for over 20 years. Whatever happened, just tell me." She took a deep breath that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. "Last night, Derek did something that..." She paused, searching for words that didn't seem to exist. "He challenged God directly, Marcus. He destroyed my Bible and said things that no human being should ever say. And what happened to him afterward?" Her voice trailed off, and she stared out the window at the empty parking lot. "Marcus, I don't think what happened to Derek was natural. I think God answered his challenge." The way she said those words sent chills down my spine. This was Sarah, practical, level-headed Sarah who worked as a nurse and dealt with medical facts every day. She wasn't prone to fantasy or exaggeration. "What exactly happened to Derek?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Sarah's eyes met mine, and in them I saw something that would haunt me forever. Absolute certainty mixed with absolute terror. "That's what I need to tell you, Marcus. Because after tonight, I know that God is real, and his power is not something any human being should ever dare to test." Sarah wrapped her hands around the coffee mug as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. The steam rose between us like a veil, and for a moment I wondered if this was all some terrible dream. But the haunted look in her eyes told me otherwise. "To understand what happened last night, you need to know who Derek really is," she began, her voice steadier now but still carrying that underlying tremor. "The man I married 15 years ago isn't the man who lives in my house today." She paused, staring into her coffee, as if the dark liquid might reveal answers to questions she'd been asking herself for years. Derek was different when we met. He'd just returned from his second tour in Afghanistan, and yes, he drank, but so did most of the guys coming home. I thought love could heal whatever wounds the war had left. I remembered Derek from those early days. He'd been charming in a rough-around-the-edges way, with piercing blue eyes and a smile that could light up a room when he chose to use it. Sarah had been radiant back then, full of hopes and dreams about their future together. "The drinking got worse after his father died," she continued, her fingers unconsciously tracing the rim of her mug. "Then came the pills. First for his back pain from an IED explosion, then for his nightmares. When the doctors cut him off, he found other ways to get what he needed. The transformation had been gradual, but relentless. Derek's military discipline had morphed into controlling behavior. His protectiveness had become possessiveness. His strength had become intimidation. But the worst part wasn't the addiction, Marcus. It was what happened to his soul." Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Something inside him turned bitter, then angry, then evil. He started hating everything good in the world, especially anything connected to God. She described how Derek would fly into rages whenever she mentioned church, prayer, or even basic moral principles. He'd mock her faith, calling her weak and stupid for believing in what he called fairy tales for losers who can't handle reality. Last Christmas, when I asked if we could attend the Christmas Eve service together, he laughed in my face and said the only miracle would be if I grew a brain. Tears formed in her eyes at the memory. Then he threw my nativity set against the wall, breaking the baby Jesus figure into pieces. The Derek she described was a far cry from the man I'd known years ago. This version was calculated in his cruelty, choosing his words and actions specifically to wound Sarah's spirit. He'd isolated her from friends, made her feel guilty for her faith, and created an atmosphere of constant fear in their home. He'd come home drunk and high, ranting about how religion was responsible for all the world's problems, she continued. He'd say that if God existed, he was either powerless or evil for allowing the things Derek had seen in war. The anger consumed him, Marcus. It became who he was. Sarah explained how Derek's hatred had intensified over the past year. He'd started bringing home books by famous atheists, leaving them open on the kitchen table, as if to taunt her. He'd turn up the volume on TV shows that mocked Christianity whenever she was in the room. 2 months ago, he found my prayer journal. Her voice cracked slightly. He read it out loud in a mocking voice, imitating me praying for his salvation. Then he tore out every page and flushed them down the toilet while laughing. The psychological warfare had been relentless and methodical. Derek seemed to take pleasure in crushing Sarah's spirit, as if destroying her faith could somehow validate his own empty worldview. He'd become a man at war with God himself, using his wife as a battlefield. I kept praying for him, kept believing he could change, Sarah said, wiping away a tear that had escaped despite her best efforts to maintain composure. I thought, if I just loved him enough, if I just stayed faithful enough, God would soften his heart. She looked directly at me then, and I saw the weight of years of abuse, manipulation, and spiritual warfare etched into her features. But Derek wasn't just fighting me anymore, Marcus. He was fighting God. And last night, he decided to take that fight directly to the source. The diner suddenly felt colder, and I noticed that even the usual late-night sounds from the kitchen had stopped. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for Sarah to reveal what had pushed her husband over the edge into direct confrontation with the divine. What happened last night changed everything, she whispered, because Derek got the answer he was looking for. And it was more terrible than either of us could have ever imagined. Sarah's hands began to shake again as she prepared to relive the events of the previous night. I could see her gathering courage, the way someone might steel themselves before walking through fire. It started like any other Friday night, she began, her voice taking on a distant quality, as if she were watching the events unfold from outside her own body. Derek had been at Murphy's Tavern since 4 o'clock. I could smell the whiskey on him the moment he walked through the door, but this time was different. His eyes had this wild look I'd never seen before. She paused to take a sip of coffee, her cup rattling against the saucer as she set it down. I was in the living room, reading my Bible. It was the one my grandmother gave me when I was confirmed, leather-bound, with my name embossed in gold letters. I'd been reading Psalm 23, trying to find peace after another day of walking on eggshells. The image was heartbreaking, Sarah seeking comfort in scripture while her husband drowned his demons in alcohol and whatever pills he could get his hands on. I'd seen this pattern destroy so many families in our community. Derek slammed the front door so hard it rattled the windows, she continued. I looked up from my Bible, and that's when I saw him really looking at me for the first time in months. But it wasn't recognition in his eyes, it was pure hatred. Sarah described how Derek had stumbled into the living room, his movements unsteady but purposeful. He'd been muttering under his breath, words she couldn't quite make out, but that carried the tone of someone building up to an explosion. "Still reading your book of lies," he sneered at me. I tried to close the Bible quietly, hoping to avoid a confrontation, but that just made him angrier. Her voice grew smaller, as if she were that frightened woman all over again. He said, No, don't stop on my account. Please continue believing in your imaginary friend who lets children starve while you sit here comfortable and safe. The confrontation had escalated with terrifying speed. Derek, emboldened by whatever cocktail of substances was coursing through his system, had decided this would be the night to settle his score with Sarah's faith once and for all. He lurched toward me and snatched the Bible right out of my hands, Sarah continued, her voice breaking slightly. I begged him not to hurt it, told him it was all I had left of my grandmother, but that just seemed to fuel his rage even more. What happened next would be seared into Sarah's memory forever. Derek had held the Bible above his head like a trophy, his face twisted with a satisfaction that bordered on demonic. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Let's see what your precious God thinks about this." The destruction that followed was systematic and deliberate. Derek didn't just damage the Bible, he desecrated it with the calculated precision of someone who understood the spiritual significance of what he was doing. He started tearing out pages, one by one, reading passages out loud in this mocking, theatrical voice. Sarah whispered. When he got to John 3:16, he crumpled it up and threw it at my face, saying, "For God so loved the world that he let it burn in hell." But Derek wasn't finished. He dragged Sarah to the kitchen and forced her to watch as he turned on the gas stove. The blue flames danced like demons as he began feeding pages from the Bible into the fire. The smell was horrible, Marcus. Not just burning paper, something else, something acrid and wrong. The smoke seemed to move against the natural air current, swirling in patterns that made my skin crawl. Sarah's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. And Derek was laughing, not his normal laugh, this sound that didn't seem human. As the flames consumed page after page of sacred text, Derek's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began shouting at the ceiling, as if addressing someone invisible but very real to him in that moment. Then he took what was left of the Bible, just the covers and a few pages, and threw the whole thing into the sink. He poured lighter fluid on it and lit it with a match. Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the memory. As it burned, he started saying things that I can barely repeat, Marcus. Horrible, blasphemous things. The final act of Derek's spiritual warfare had been the most chilling. Standing over the burning remains of the Bible, he'd raised his fists toward the ceiling and issued a direct challenge that would change both their lives forever. He screamed, "If you're real, if you exist, then prove it. Strike me down right now. Show me your power." Sarah's voice cracked completely. And then he said something so awful, so unforgivable, that I ran from the room with my hands over my ears. Sarah looked at me with eyes that had seen something beyond human comprehension. Marcus, I've never believed in the supernatural beyond basic faith, but what happened to Derek in the hours after that challenge? It wasn't natural. It couldn't have been. The weight of her words settled over our table like a shroud. Whatever had transpired in those dark hours after Derek's blasphemous challenge had shaken Sarah's understanding of reality to its very core. God answered him, Marcus. And the answer was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The fluorescent light above our booth flickered as Sarah prepared to share the details she'd been holding back. I could see the internal struggle on her face, the need to tell someone what she'd witnessed warring against the horror of reliving those moments. After Derek burned my Bible, after he challenged God, she stopped, closing her eyes as if the memory was too painful to face head-on. Marcus, the words that came out of his mouth next weren't just blasphemy. They were evil in its purest form. I leaned forward, sensing we were approaching the heart of whatever had shattered Sarah's world. The diner around us seemed to grow quieter, as if even the ambient noise was afraid to interrupt what she was about to reveal. He stood there in our kitchen, swaying from the alcohol and drugs, and he began cursing God with words I didn't even know existed. Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. He called God every vile name you could imagine, but worse than that, he challenged his very nature, his love, his power. The litany of blasphemy that followed had been systematic and deliberate. Derek hadn't been simply venting anger. He'd been conducting what could only be described as spiritual warfare, declaring himself an enemy of the divine with calculated precision. He said that if Jesus was real, he was a liar and a fraud. He mocked the crucifixion, calling it the greatest con job in human history. Sarah's hands trembled as she spoke. Then he said he wished he could have been there to spit in Christ's face as he died. But Derek's assault on the sacred hadn't stopped there. In his drug and alcohol-fueled rage, he'd crossed lines that even hardened atheists wouldn't dare approach. He'd targeted the most fundamental aspects of Christian faith with language so vile it seemed to pollute the very air around him. He started ranting about the Holy Spirit, calling it a lie used to control weak minds, Sarah whispered. Then he said he renounced any claim God might have on his soul. He declared himself forever beyond redemption, beyond forgiveness. The temperature in the diner seemed to drop several degrees as Sarah recounted her husband's words. I found myself involuntarily shivering, though I couldn't tell if it was from cold or from something far more primal, a recognition that we were discussing forces beyond human understanding. But the worst part came at the end, Sarah continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Derek looked up at the ceiling, his face twisted with absolute hatred, and he said, I curse you, God. I curse your name, your Son, and everything you claim to stand for. If you exist, I challenge you to damn me. Do your worst, because I'm not afraid of you or your hell. The silence that had followed Derek's challenge had been absolute, not just quiet, but a complete absence of sound that seemed unnatural. Sarah described how even the usual house noises, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of clocks, the settling of old wood, had simply stopped. It was like the entire world was holding its breath, she said. Derek just stood there for a moment, swaying on his feet, with this satisfied smirk on his face. He actually looked proud of himself, as if he'd won some kind of victory. Then Derek had turned his attention back to Sarah, his eyes filled with a cruelty she'd never seen before. He'd grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip painful, and forced her to look at the smoldering remains of her Bible in the sink. He told me that this was what my faith was worth, ashes and smoke. He said that if God really loved me, he would have stopped him from destroying the Bible. Sarah's voice broke completely. Then he laughed and said he was going to bed to sleep like a baby because he finally felt free from the superstitious nonsense that had been haunting him. Sarah had remained in the kitchen long after Derek stumbled to their bedroom. She'd stared at the burned remains of her grandmother's Bible, feeling as if something precious and irreplaceable had been torn from her soul. The acrid smell of burned paper and leather had filled the house, but underneath it was something else, something that made her skin crawl. "I tried to pray, Marcus, but the words wouldn't come," she said. "It felt like Derek's blasphemy had poisoned the very air, making it impossible for anything holy to exist in that space." Eventually, exhaustion had overcome her shock, and she'd made her way to the guest bedroom where she'd been sleeping for the past 6 months. But sleep had been elusive, interrupted by sounds from Derek's room that she couldn't quite identify. Not snoring, but something else, something that sounded almost like conversation. "Around 4 a.m. I finally drifted off," Sarah concluded. "When I woke up the next morning, everything had changed. Derek was different. And that's when I realized that God had indeed answered his challenge." She looked at me with eyes that had witnessed something beyond the realm of normal human experience. "Marcus, what I found when I went to check on Derek that morning, it wasn't natural. It couldn't have been coincidence. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before." The way she said those words sent ice through my veins. Whatever Sarah had discovered the next morning had convinced this practical, level-headed woman that supernatural forces were at work in her home. "What did you find, Sarah?" I asked, though every instinct told me I didn't want to know the answer. Sarah's eyes took on a distant quality, as if she were looking through time itself back to that terrible morning. The coffee in her cup had grown cold, but she hadn't touched it in several minutes. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed something that defied all rational explanation. "I woke up around 7:30, which was unusual for me on a Saturday," she began, her fingers unconsciously fidgeting with the sugar packets on the table. "Normally, Derek would have been up for hours by then, stomping around the house, slamming cabinet doors, making his presence known. But that morning, Marcus, the silence was absolute." She described how the house had felt different from the moment she opened her eyes, not just quiet, empty, as if something fundamental had been drained from the atmosphere. Even the usual morning sounds from outside seemed muted, as though the very air had thickened overnight. "I lay in bed for probably 10 minutes just listening," Sarah continued. "No shower running, no television, no cursing from the kitchen, nothing. At first I thought maybe Derek had passed out from all the drinking and pills. It wouldn't have been the first time. But as the minutes ticked by, Sarah's concern had grown into something approaching dread. Derek was many things: violent, unpredictable, cruel, but he was also a creature of habit. His morning routine never varied. Wake up hungover, stumble to the bathroom, shower while cursing about his headache, then start the day with whatever combination of pills and alcohol would get him functional. "I finally got the courage to leave my room around 8 o'clock, she said. "The hallway felt wrong somehow, colder than it should have been, and there was this smell in the air, not the usual smell of cigarettes and stale beer, but something else. Something sick and sweet like flowers at a funeral." Sarah had approached Derek's bedroom with growing apprehension. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Derek always slept with it firmly closed, a habit from his military days. She'd pressed her ear against the wood, listening for any sound of movement or breathing. "That's when I heard it," she whispered, her voice dropping so low I had to lean across the table to catch her words. "Not snoring, not talking, but this sound like whimpering, like a grown man crying, but trying to muffle the sound." The image was jarring. Derek, the tough ex-soldier who'd spent years intimidating his wife, reduced to hiding his tears in the darkness of his bedroom. Sarah had stood frozen outside the door, torn between concern and the very real fear of what she might find inside. "I knocked softly and called his name," she continued. The whimpering stopped immediately, but he didn't answer. "So I pushed the door open just a crack and looked inside. What Sarah had seen in that bedroom would haunt her for the rest of her life. Derek was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with his back to the door. But something about his posture was wrong. Not the usual slouch of a hungover man, but the rigid, trembling position of someone in the grip of absolute terror. His hair was completely soaked with sweat, even though the room was freezing cold, Sarah said. His shoulders were shaking, and I could see his hands clenched so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white. But what scared me most was that he was perfectly still, not the restless movement of someone detoxing, but the frozen stillness of prey hiding from a predator. Sarah had whispered Derek's name again, and this time he'd turned to look at her. The face that met her gaze was almost unrecognizable, not just from the physical effects of his binge, but from something far more profound. His eyes, Marcus. Sarah paused, searching for words adequate to describe what she'd witnessed. I've seen Derek drunk, high, angry, violent, but I'd never seen him afraid. Not really afraid. But that morning, his eyes were wide with absolute terror. Not the fear of getting caught or facing consequences, but the fear of someone who'd seen something that shouldn't exist. Derek's face had been pale as parchment, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept at all. But more disturbing than his appearance was his behavior. This man who'd spent years intimidating everyone around him was now trembling like a child who'd awakened from the worst nightmare imaginable. I asked him if he was okay, if he needed me to call a doctor, Sarah continued. He tried to speak, but only a croak came out. When he finally managed words, all he said was, "Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." The Derek she'd known would never have admitted weakness or asked for help. His entire identity was built on being tough, on facing whatever life threw at him with anger and defiance. But the man sitting on that bed was broken in a way that went far beyond physical discomfort. I stepped into the room, and that's when I noticed the other things, Sarah said, her voice growing even quieter. Things that couldn't be explained by drinking or drugs, or even a bad reaction to whatever pills he'd taken. She described how the bedroom's temperature seemed to fluctuate wildly, freezing near the door, but uncomfortably warm near Derek's side of the bed. The air itself felt thick, almost viscous, as if she were moving through water instead of atmosphere. And the smell was stronger in there. Not just that sickly sweet odor, but something else underneath it. Something rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. Sarah's face contorted with disgust at the memory. But Derek was clean, Marcus. He'd obviously showered recently. His clothes were fresh. The smell wasn't coming from him. The most disturbing detail was what Sarah noticed on the nightstand. Derek's alarm clock, which had worked perfectly for years, was blinking 12 repeatedly. But more than that, the digital display seemed to flicker between numbers that made no sense, occasionally showing times that didn't exist, like 2573 or 8899. That's when I knew that whatever happened to Derek after his challenge wasn't natural, Sarah concluded, because the man I found that morning wasn't just hungover or sick. He was a man who'd received an answer to his blasphemous prayer, and that answer was more terrible than either of us could have imagined. Sarah's hands had stopped shaking, but her voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on both of us as she continued her account. The diner around us had grown even quieter, if that was possible, and I found myself unconsciously leaning forward, drawn into her narrative despite my growing unease. What happened over the next few hours convinced me that Derek hadn't just had a bad night, Sarah began, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window. These weren't symptoms of withdrawal or even a psychotic break. These were signs, manifestations of something I'd only read about in scripture. She described how Derek had remained frozen on the edge of the bed for nearly an hour, occasionally glancing toward the corner of the room as if someone were standing there. When Sarah followed his gaze, she saw nothing but shadows that seemed darker than they should have been, shadows that appeared to move independently of any light source. I brought him water and aspirin, thinking he was just dehydrated, Sarah continued. But when I handed him the glass, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't hold it. Not the tremors of someone detoxing. His whole body would seize up, like he was being shocked by electricity. The physical manifestations had been disturbing enough, but what truly frightened Sarah were the things Derek began to notice around the house. Items that had been in the same places for years were suddenly moved, not obviously, but just enough to be noticeable. Pictures hung slightly crooked, books were turned backwards on shelves, and the crosses Sarah kept throughout the house were all found face down that morning. I asked Derek if he'd been up during the night moving things around, Sarah said. He looked at me with these wide, terrified eyes and whispered, "I never left the bed. I couldn't leave the bed." Oh, what Derek meant by that statement became clear as the day progressed. He seemed unable to move more than a few feet from where he'd awakened, as if some invisible force were keeping him tethered to that spot. When he tried to walk to the bathroom, he'd make it halfway down the hall before suddenly stopping, his face contorted in pain. It was like watching someone walk into an invisible wall, Sarah explained. He'd reach out with his hands, feeling for something that wasn't there, then stumble backward with this look of absolute confusion and fear. But the physical limitations were just the beginning. Derek began reporting sensations that defied medical explanation. Burning cold that seemed to come from inside his bones, the taste of sulfur in his mouth despite brushing his teeth repeatedly, and a constant ringing in his ears that sounded, according to him, like distant screaming. Around noon, I suggested we go to the emergency room, Sarah said. Derek actually agreed, which should have been my first clue that something was seriously wrong. This man had never admitted to needing medical help for anything. The attempt to leave the house had been the most disturbing event yet. Derek had managed to get dressed and walk to the front door, but the moment he tried to cross the threshold, he'd collapsed, as if struck by an invisible force. Sarah had found him convulsing on the floor, his lips moving, but no sound coming out. When the convulsion stopped, he looked up at me and said, "I can't leave. Something won't let me leave." Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I've been a nurse for 15 years. I've seen seizures, panic attacks, drug reactions. This wasn't any of those things." The rest of that day had been a series of increasingly inexplicable events. Electronics throughout the house began malfunctioning. Televisions would turn on by themselves, always tuned to static. The radio would scan through stations on its own, occasionally stopping on what sounded like voices speaking in languages neither Sarah nor Derek recognized. The temperature in the house kept fluctuating wildly, Sarah continued. One room would be freezing while the next was stifling hot. And always, there was that smell, sweet and rotten at the same time, strongest wherever Derek happened to be. But perhaps most disturbing of all were the sounds that began around dinner time, knocking from inside the walls, footsteps in empty rooms, and what sounded like whispered conversations just at the edge of hearing. Derek claimed he could understand some of the whispers, though he refused to tell Sarah what they were saying. By evening, Derek was a completely different person, Sarah said, not just scared, broken. This man who'd spent our entire marriage trying to prove he was stronger than God was now jumping at every shadow, flinching at sounds only he could hear. The final incident of that first day had convinced Sarah that supernatural forces were at work. Around 10 p.m., Derek had suddenly stood up from the couch where he'd been sitting in terrified silence and walked to the kitchen. Sarah had followed, worried about what he might do. "He stood at the sink, looking down at the burned remains of my Bible," she said. "Then he started to cry, not just tears, but deep, wrenching sobs, like I'd never heard from him before. He kept saying, 'I'm sorry,' over and over again. But as Derek wept over the destruction he'd caused, something impossible happened. The water from the faucet, which had been running clear, suddenly turned dark, not brown like rust, but black as ink, and the smell that arose from it was so foul that both Sarah and Derek had stumbled backward, gagging. I turned off the faucet and ran water in the bathroom. It was perfectly normal, Sarah concluded, but the kitchen sink continued to drip that black liquid for hours, leaving stains that wouldn't wash out no matter what I tried. She looked at me with eyes that had seen the impossible made manifest. Marcus, these weren't coincidences or hallucinations. Derek had challenged God, and God was responding. The question was, what was going to happen next? As Sarah posed that question, I realized that everything she'd described so far was just the beginning. Whatever forces Derek had unleashed with his blasphemous challenge were just getting started, and the worst was yet to come. The weight of Sarah's story was becoming almost unbearable, but I found myself unable to look away from her haunted expression. She'd paused to gather herself, and when she continued, her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who'd witnessed the impossible and was still trying to process it. The second night was when Derek's terror turned into something else entirely, Sarah began, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the table's surface. If the first day had broken his pride, the second night shattered his sanity, and that's when I realized that whatever was happening to him was far from over. Sarah described how Derek had refused to go to bed, instead spending the entire night pacing the living room like a caged animal. But his movement was limited to a roughly 10-foot circle. Any attempt to venture beyond that invisible boundary resulted in the same violent reaction she'd witnessed at the front door. He kept muttering to himself, but not the usual angry rants I was used to, she continued. These were desperate whispers, like he was trying to negotiate with someone I couldn't see. He'd stop suddenly and tilt his head as if listening to a response, then shake his head frantically and continue pacing. Around 2 a.m., Derek's behavior had escalated dramatically. He'd suddenly frozen in the middle of his pacing and stared at the ceiling with an expression of absolute horror. Sarah had followed his gaze but seen nothing unusual, just the same popcorn ceiling they'd looked at for 15 years. He started backing away from something, his hands held up defensively, Sarah said. Then he began to scream. Not words, just raw, primal terror. It went on for almost 5 minutes before he collapsed to his knees, sobbing. When Derek had finally been able to speak, his words had chilled Sarah to the bone. He claimed that something had shown him images, visions of his future that were so terrible he couldn't bring himself to describe them. All he would say was that he was being shown what awaited him, and it was worse than any hell he'd ever imagined. That's when he first asked me about prayer, Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and sorrow. Derek, the man who'd spent years mocking my faith, looked at me with desperate eyes and asked if I thought God would listen if he tried to apologize. But Derek's attempt at repentance had been met with immediate and violent opposition. The moment he'd tried to speak a prayer, even the most basic words of remorse, he'd been seized by convulsions so severe that Sarah had been afraid he was dying. It was like watching someone being electrocuted, she explained. His whole body would arch backward, his eyes would roll back, and this horrible choking sound would come from his throat. The convulsions would only stop when he stopped trying to pray. The pattern had repeated throughout the night. Derek would work up the courage to attempt some form of communication with God, only to be struck down by increasingly violent physical reactions. By dawn, he was exhausted and defeated, convinced that he'd crossed a line from which there could be no return. Sunday morning, Derek tried a different approach, Sarah continued. He couldn't pray, but he thought maybe he could undo some of the damage by replacing what he'd destroyed. He asked me to drive him to the Christian bookstore to buy a new Bible. The trip had been a disaster from the start. Derek had managed to get into the car. Apparently, the invisible barrier didn't prevent him from leaving if Sarah was driving. But the moment they'd pulled into the bookstore's parking lot, Derek had begun experiencing what could only be described as an allergic reaction to the sacred space. His skin started breaking out in hives, his breathing became labored, and his eyes began streaming tears, Sarah said. But he was determined to go inside. He said he had to try to make things right. Derek's attempt to enter the Christian bookstore had been both heartbreaking and terrifying. He'd made it only 3 steps inside before collapsing to the floor, his body racked with the same violent convulsions Sarah had witnessed at home. The other customers had stared in shock as this large, tough-looking man writhed on the floor like someone possessed. The store manager wanted to call an ambulance, but Derek begged us not to, Sarah explained. He said doctors couldn't help him with this. He knew what was happening to him wasn't medical. It was spiritual. And then they'd left the bookstore without purchasing anything, Derek's face a mask of despair and growing hopelessness. On the drive home, he'd spoken more openly about what he was experiencing than he had since the ordeal began. He told me that the worst part wasn't the physical symptoms, Sarah said. It was the knowledge. Somehow he knew things now. Terrible things about his future, about what awaited him. He said it was like having a window into hell, and he couldn't close his eyes to block out what he was seeing. Derek had also begun experiencing what he described as visitations, encounters with presences that only he could perceive. These weren't hallucinations brought on by drugs or alcohol withdrawal, but conscious, interactive experiences with entities that seemed to take pleasure in his suffering. He said they would whisper things to him, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. Details about his past sins, reminders of every cruel thing he'd ever done, predictions about how much worse his punishment would become. By Sunday evening, Derek had reached a state of complete desperation. He'd begged Sarah to contact their pastor, their former pastor, any religious leader who might be able to help him. But when she'd tried to make the calls, Derek's reactions had become so violent that she'd been forced to stop. It was like something was actively preventing him from seeking help, Sarah said. Every attempt to reach out to God or God's representatives was met with immediate and severe retaliation. The most disturbing revelation had come late Sunday night, when Derek had finally found the strength to tell Sarah what the entities had revealed to him about his challenge to God. He said they told him that his blasphemy had been so complete, so thorough, that he'd severed his connection to divine grace permanently, Sarah whispered. They said he'd gotten exactly what he'd asked for, God's attention, and that attention would never leave him. As Sarah finished describing Derek's growing desperation, I realized that we'd only scratched the surface of this supernatural nightmare. Whatever forces Derek had unleashed were methodically destroying him, piece by piece, and the worst was yet to come. The 3rd day brought a change in Derek that Sarah hadn't expected. Instead of the cowering, terrified man she'd watched deteriorate over the previous 48 hours, she found him sitting at their computer, frantically typing with a determination that bordered on manic. I came downstairs Monday morning to find Derek hunched over the laptop, Sarah continued, her voice carrying a note of bewilderment. For the first time since Friday night, he seemed focused on something other than his terror. But what he was researching, Marcus, it scared me more than his breakdowns had. Derek had spent the entire night searching the internet for answers, diving deep into websites and forums that Sarah had never known existed. His browser history revealed a desperate journey through the darkest corners of human spiritual experience, sites dedicated to supernatural encounters, divine punishment, and cases of people who claimed to have experienced what Derek was going through. He'd found stories, Sarah said, her hands clenching into fists on the table. Dozens of them. People from all over the world who described experiences almost identical to what Derek was living through. People who challenged God directly and then faced consequences. The research had given Derek a framework for understanding his ordeal, but it had also revealed something that filled him with even greater dread. According to the accounts he'd found, what he was experiencing was just the beginning. A preliminary phase that could last weeks or even months before reaching its true climax. One website had a timeline, Sarah continued, her voice growing smaller. It described stages of what it called divine retribution for those who committed the ultimate blasphemy. Derek had printed out the entire article and highlighted sections that matched his experience. The timeline was methodical and terrifying in its precision. It began with physical symptoms and psychological torment, progressed through spiritual isolation and supernatural manifestations, and culminated in something the website referred to as the final visitation, an encounter that would determine the blasphemer's ultimate fate. Derek showed me the printouts, Sarah said. According to this research, he was only in stage 2 of a 7-stage process, and each stage was supposed to be worse than the last. But the most disturbing part of Derek's research wasn't the timeline. It was the realization that his case was unusually severe. Most of the accounts described people who'd committed blasphemy in moments of anger or despair, but Derek had done something different. He'd systematically and deliberately challenged every aspect of the divine, making his offense more comprehensive than typical cases. There was one forum post that made Derek completely break down, Sarah continued. It was from someone who claimed to be a former pastor who'd studied cases like Derek's. He wrote that when someone commits what he called total blasphemy, denying God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit while destroying sacred objects, they enter what he termed the point of no return. According to this former pastor's post, there were only 3 recorded cases in modern history of people who'd committed total blasphemy as comprehensively as Derek had. Of those 3 cases, none had ended well. 2 had resulted in the individuals taking their own lives before the process reached its conclusion, and the 3rd had simply disappeared, leaving behind only a room that no one could enter without experiencing overwhelming dread. Derek read that post out loud to me, Sarah said, tears beginning to form in her eyes. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "Sarah, I think I've damned myself, really truly damned myself, and there's no way back." But Derek's research had also uncovered something else, accounts of people who'd found ways to fight back, to seek redemption, even after committing seemingly unforgivable acts. These stories were rare and often incomplete, but they offered a glimmer of hope that kept Derek from complete despair. He found testimonies from people who'd experienced similar supernatural attacks and managed to overcome them through genuine repentance, Sarah explained. But the process was described as brutal, requiring the person to face their sins directly and endure whatever punishment God deemed necessary. One particular account had captured Derek's attention completely. It was the testimony of a man who'd spent 3 months in what he described as spiritual purgatory, experiencing supernatural torment while fighting for his soul's redemption. The man claimed that his salvation had come only after he'd accepted full responsibility for his actions and submitted completely to God's judgment. Derek became obsessed with this one story, Sarah said. He read it over and over, taking notes, trying to understand exactly what the man had done to earn his redemption. But every time Derek tried to follow the same path, the same thing happened. Violent physical reactions that prevented him from making any spiritual progress. The research had also revealed why Derek couldn't leave the house or approach sacred spaces. According to several sources, people in his condition were essentially quarantined by supernatural forces, prevented from contaminating holy ground or seeking help from religious authorities until they'd either found redemption or been completely consumed by their punishment. Derek found a term for what was happening to him, Sarah continued. The websites called it spiritual quarantine, a state where the person becomes untouchable by normal religious intervention. They have to find their own way back to God, or they're lost forever. By Monday evening, Derek had compiled a notebook full of research, testimonies, and potential solutions. But with each passing hour, the supernatural manifestations in their home were growing stronger, as if whatever forces were tormenting him were responding to his attempts to fight back. That night, Derek made a decision, Sarah said, her voice filled with dread. He told me that he was going to try something he'd read about, a form of confession so complete and honest that it might break through whatever barrier was preventing him from reaching God. The look in Sarah's eyes told me that Derek's attempt at ultimate confession would bring consequences neither of them had anticipated. Whatever he was about to try would push his supernatural ordeal into a new and even more terrifying phase. What happened when Derek tried this complete confession changed everything, Marcus. Because that's when we discovered that something else had been listening to his research, something that didn't want him to find redemption. Sarah's composure, which had held throughout the telling of this impossible story, finally began to crack as she approached what was clearly the most traumatic part of her ordeal. Her hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd witnessed something that had fundamentally altered her understanding of reality. Monday night, Derek decided to attempt what he called the ultimate confession, Sarah began, her eyes distant and haunted. Based on his research, he believed that if he could confess every sin he'd ever committed with complete honesty and genuine remorse, it might break through whatever spiritual barrier was keeping him from God's grace. Derek had prepared for this confession with the methodical precision of his military training. He'd written out a detailed list of every wrongdoing he could remember, starting from childhood lies and progressing through increasingly serious offenses. The list had taken him hours to compile and filled nearly 20 pages of notebook paper. Around midnight, Derek positioned himself in the center of our living room, Sarah continued. He'd moved all the furniture against the walls, creating an open space where he could kneel. He said he wanted nothing between him and God when he made his confession. What happened next would be seared into Sarah's memory forever. Derek had begun his confession quietly, reading from his handwritten list, with a humility Sarah had never seen from him before. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal, just a broken man attempting to make peace with his creator. Then Derek got to the confession about his time in Afghanistan, Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. He started describing things he'd done during the war, not just the combat operations, but other things, darker things that he'd never told anyone about. As Derek delved deeper into his wartime confessions, the atmosphere in the room began to change dramatically. The temperature plummeted until Sarah could see her own breath, and the air itself seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. But most disturbing of all was the silence that fell over everything, not just quiet, but an absolute absence of sound that felt oppressive and unnatural. Derek was describing an incident involving civilians, Sarah continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. He was confessing to something terrible that had happened during a raid, something that had haunted him for years. And that's when, Marcus, that's when we both learned the truth about why Derek was being punished so severely. What Derek revealed in that moment of complete honesty was something so shocking that it recontextualized everything Sarah thought she knew about her husband's spiritual condition. The blasphemy of Friday night hadn't been Derek's first offense against God. It had been the final act in a pattern of escalating defiance that stretched back years. He confessed that he'd been deliberately challenging God since before we were married, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Every time something good happened in his life, our wedding, his promotions, even small blessings, Derek would privately curse God and claim credit for his own success. He'd been conducting a secret war against the divine for over a decade, but the most devastating revelation was yet to come. As Derek continued his confession, he revealed that his hatred of Sarah's faith hadn't been rooted in skepticism or rational disbelief. It had been motivated by jealousy, a twisted resentment that God loved Sarah in a way that Derek felt he could never achieve. He told me that every time he saw me pray, every time he witnessed my faith bringing me peace, it filled him with rage, Sarah whispered. Not because he thought I was deluded, but because he knew I had something real, something he'd deliberately cut himself off from through years of secret blasphemy. The ultimate confession revealed the true scope of Derek's spiritual rebellion. He'd been systematically rejecting God's grace for years, accumulating what he now realized was an insurmountable debt of defiance. Friday night's destruction of the Bible had simply been the final straw that had triggered divine intervention. Derek broke down completely as he confessed all of this, Sarah continued. He sobbed like a child as he described how his secret war against God had poisoned every good thing in his life. And that's when something responded to his confession, but it wasn't what we were hoping for. As Derek reached the end of his litany of hidden sins, a presence made itself known in the room. Not the benevolent response to genuine repentance they'd been praying for, but something far more terrifying. The air began to move in patterns that defied natural physics, swirling around Derek in tight circles that seemed to be evaluating him. "A voice spoke," Sarah said, her entire body now trembling with the memory. Not audible words, but something that bypassed our ears and spoke directly into our minds. And what it said destroyed any hope Derek had of easy redemption. The voice had confirmed Derek's worst fears. His years of secret blasphemy, culminating in Friday night's public challenge, had indeed severed his connection to divine grace. But more than that, the voice revealed that Derek's punishment was not arbitrary cruelty, but justice perfectly calibrated to match his crimes. The voice told Derek that he'd gotten exactly what he'd asked for over all those years, Sarah continued. He'd wanted to live without God's influence in his life, and his wish had been granted. But what Derek hadn't understood was that God's influence includes not just rules and restrictions, but also protection from forces that are far worse than divine judgment. The devastating truth was that Derek's spiritual quarantine wasn't just keeping him from reaching God, it was also removing divine protection that had been shielding him from something far more malevolent. His challenge to God had essentially announced to darker forces that he was available, unprotected, and fair game. The voice explained that Derek's real punishment wasn't the supernatural manifestations he'd been experiencing, Sarah said, her voice barely audible now. Those were just preliminaries. His real punishment would be facing eternity completely cut off from God's love, protection, and presence, which means facing whatever fills that void. As the voice finished delivering its verdict, Derek had collapsed to the floor, his spirit completely broken by the realization of what he'd brought upon himself. But the most terrifying part was what the voice revealed about Sarah's role in what was to come. It told us that Derek's fate could still be changed, Sarah whispered, but only through a sacrifice that would test the very limits of human love and faith, and that sacrifice would have to come from me. The implication of those words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. Whatever path to redemption existed for Derek would require Sarah to risk everything, possibly including her own soul, to save the man who had tormented her for years. The revelation about the required sacrifice had shattered whatever composure Sarah had maintained throughout her ordeal. She sat in our diner booth, tears streaming down her face as she prepared to describe what followed that devastating midnight revelation. After the voice finished speaking, everything in our house went completely insane, Sarah began, her voice shaking with exhaustion and trauma. It was like Derek's complete confession had unleashed forces that had been held in check, and now they were free to show their true power. The supernatural manifestations that had been building over the previous 3 days exploded into full chaos. Every electronic device in the house activated simultaneously, televisions blaring static, radios scanning through stations at impossible speeds, smoke detectors shrieking despite no signs of fire. The cacophony was deafening and seemed designed to prevent any possibility of prayer or peaceful thought. Derek was still on the floor, curled into a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably, Sarah continued. But now he wasn't just crying from despair. He was reacting to things I couldn't see. He kept flinching and cowering as if something was striking him, leaving marks on his skin that appeared out of nowhere. The temperature fluctuations that had plagued their home intensified beyond anything Sarah had experienced. Frost began forming on the windows despite the summer heat outside, while other areas of the house became so hot that paint began to bubble and peel from the walls. The smell of sulfur mixed with that sickly sweet funeral flower odor became so overwhelming that Sarah had to breathe through her mouth to avoid vomiting. But the worst part was the sound of Derek's suffering, Sarah said, her voice breaking completely. He wasn't just crying anymore, he was screaming. Not the angry screams I was used to from his drunken rages, but sounds of pure agony, as if he was being tortured in ways I couldn't see. The invisible forces tormenting Derek seemed to take particular pleasure in his helplessness. Sarah watched in horror as her husband was lifted off the floor by unseen hands, suspended in mid-air for several seconds before being dropped roughly back down. The attacks were methodical and cruel, designed to cause maximum psychological damage rather than physical harm. I tried to help him, Sarah continued, but every time I got close, something would push me away. Not violently, but with enough force to make it clear that I wasn't allowed to interfere. It was like watching someone drown while being held back from jumping in to save them. The chaos wasn't limited to Derek's torment. Objects throughout the house began moving on their own, not floating peacefully, but being hurled with deliberate malice. Picture frames shattered against walls, books flew open to specific pages with highlighted passages about damnation, and every cross or religious symbol Sarah owned was systematically destroyed. Around 3 a.m., Derek managed to crawl to where I was standing, Sarah said. He grabbed my ankle with shaking hands and looked up at me with eyes that had seen hell itself. And what he told me then made me realize that his torment was far from random. It was specifically designed to break his spirit completely. Derek had whispered that the entities tormenting him weren't just punishing him for his blasphemy. They were showing him visions of his future, giving him glimpses of an eternity spent in their company. The images were so horrific that Derek couldn't describe them coherently, but their effect was visible in the absolute terror that had consumed him. He kept saying, "They're going to take me, Sarah. They're going to take me, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop them," Sarah continued. But then he grabbed my hand tighter and said something that changed everything. "Unless you're willing to trade places with me." The true nature of the sacrifice that could save Derek began to become clear. The voice had been literal when it spoke of a sacrifice that would test the limits of human love. Derek could be saved, but only if Sarah willingly took on his spiritual burden, essentially trading her own salvation for his. Derek explained what the entities had shown him, Sarah said. If I willingly accepted his punishment, his debt to divine justice would be transferred to me, but because my sin was less severe than his, I might be able to find redemption where he couldn't. The proposition was as terrifying as it was heartbreaking. Sarah would have to voluntarily sever her own connection to God's grace, experiencing the same spiritual quarantine and supernatural torment that was destroying Derek. There was no guarantee that she would be able to find her way back to salvation, and she might end up damned alongside him. The entities made it clear that this was Derek's only chance, Sarah continued, but they also made it clear that I had to choose immediately. The window for this kind of spiritual transaction was closing rapidly, and once it shut, Derek's fate would be permanently sealed. As dawn approached, the supernatural activity in the house reached a crescendo. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the air became so thick with spiritual oppression that both Sarah and Derek struggled to breathe. It was in this atmosphere of absolute chaos that Sarah was forced to make the most important decision of her life. Derek looked at me with what little sanity he had left and said, "Sarah, I know I don't deserve it. I know I've been a monster to you. But if you can save me, I swear I'll spend whatever time I have left making it up to you," Sarah whispered. And that's when I realized that despite everything he'd done to me, despite all the years of abuse and torment, I still loved him enough to consider the unthinkable. The chaos around them seemed to pause, as if every supernatural force in the house was waiting for Sarah's decision. The choice she made in that moment would determine not just Derek's fate, but the course of both their souls for eternity. Marcus, what I decided to do defied every instinct for self-preservation I had, Sarah said, looking at me with eyes that had stared into the abyss and made a conscious choice to jump. But sometimes love requires us to risk everything, even when we don't know if we'll survive the fall. Sarah paused in her narrative, and I could see her gathering strength for what was clearly the most difficult part of her story. The decision she'd made in that chaotic dawn had set in motion events that would test every aspect of her faith and humanity. I told Derek I would do it, Sarah said simply, her voice carrying the weight of that monumental choice. I agreed to trade places with him, to take on his spiritual burden. But the moment I spoke those words, something unexpected happened. The chaos stopped completely, and a different voice spoke to us. The sudden silence that had fallen over their house was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during the previous days of supernatural torment. It wasn't the oppressive quiet that had accompanied the malevolent manifestations, but a peaceful stillness that seemed to radiate comfort and hope. This new voice was completely different from the one that had delivered Derek's verdict, Sarah continued. Where the first voice had been cold and judgmental, this one carried warmth and what I can only describe as infinite compassion. And what it told us changed everything we thought we understood about Derek's situation. The voice had gently but firmly rejected Sarah's offer of sacrifice, explaining that true redemption couldn't be achieved through the transfer of spiritual debt from one person to another. Derek's path to salvation existed, but it required him to walk it himself, no matter how difficult or terrifying that journey might be. The voice told us that Derek's punishment wasn't meant to be eternal, Sarah explained. It was corrective, designed to strip away all his pride and defiance until he reached a state of genuine humility and repentance. But he had to choose to surrender willingly. It couldn't be forced on him or accepted by someone else on his behalf. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable part of Sarah's entire ordeal. The compassionate voice began to guide them through what it called the true path to redemption, a process that would require Derek to face his demons directly, but with divine assistance rather than abandonment. Derek was given a choice, Sarah said. He could continue fighting against his punishment, trying to find ways around it or escape from it, and eventually be consumed by it. Or he could accept it willingly, embrace the process of spiritual correction, and allow it to transform him into the man God had always intended him to be. The decision wasn't easy for Derek. Even in his broken state, his pride rebelled against the idea of submitting completely to divine judgment. He'd spent so many years defining himself through opposition and defiance that surrender felt like spiritual death. But then something beautiful happened, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a note of wonder. Derek looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in years, and saw what his rebellion had cost both of us. He saw the woman who'd been willing to damn herself to save him, and he realized that kind of love deserved better than what he'd become. Derek's surrender, when it finally came, was complete and authentic. He stopped trying to negotiate with God or find loopholes in divine justice. Instead, he prostrated himself on the floor of their living room and spoke words that Sarah would never forget. He said, "God, I accept whatever punishment you think I deserve. I've been fighting you for years, and I'm tired of fighting. If you can make something good out of the wreckage I've made of my life, I surrender completely to your will," Sarah recounted, tears flowing freely now. And Marcus, the moment he spoke those words, everything changed. The transformation wasn't instantaneous, but it was immediate and undeniable. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued their home began to lift, replaced by something that felt like divine presence rather than divine wrath. The supernatural manifestations didn't stop entirely, but their nature changed from torment to what could only be described as spiritual surgery. Derek began experiencing what he called holy fire, Sarah explained. It was still painful, but the pain had purpose now. Instead of random torture designed to break him, it was targeted healing designed to burn away the spiritual corruption he'd accumulated over years of rebellion. The process was intense and often overwhelming. Derek would spend hours in what appeared to be spiritual combat, wrestling with aspects of his character that needed to be purged or transformed. But now, he wasn't fighting alone. He had divine assistance, and more importantly, divine hope. The voice told us that Derek's journey back to grace would take time, Sarah continued. The damage he'd done to his soul through years of blasphemy couldn't be healed overnight. But every step forward, no matter how small, was being supported and celebrated by forces of good rather than exploited by forces of evil. During this phase of Derek's redemption, Sarah played a crucial role, not as a substitute sacrifice, but as a witness and support system. She was able to pray for Derek now, and those prayers seemed to provide him with strength during his most difficult moments of spiritual transformation. I watched my husband die and be reborn over the course of several weeks, Sarah said. The angry, defiant man who'd tormented me for years was being systematically replaced by someone I'd never met before. Someone humble, grateful, and genuinely repentant. But Derek's transformation wasn't without setbacks. The forces that had been tormenting him didn't give up easily, and they continued to tempt him with offers of easy escape from his spiritual correction. Each temptation was a test of his commitment to the redemption process. There were nights when Derek would wake up screaming, begging me to help him find a way out of the pain, Sarah continued. The old Derek would have given in to those moments of weakness, but the new Derek that was emerging had learned to see suffering as refinement rather than punishment. As Derek's genuine transformation became more evident, the supernatural manifestations in their home began to take on an entirely different character. Instead of chaos and destruction, they experienced what could only be described as miraculous interventions. Moments when divine grace became tangible and undeniable. That's when I knew Derek was really going to make it, Sarah concluded. When the same forces that had been trying to destroy him began working to restore him instead. The man I'd been married to was gone, but someone infinitely better was taking his place. The most difficult part of Derek's journey was behind them, but Sarah's story wasn't over yet. The final test of Derek's transformation would require him to face the ultimate consequence of his actions and prove that his redemption was complete. Sarah's expression shifted as she approached what was clearly the climactic moment of her incredible journey. Despite everything she'd already shared, I sensed that the most intense part of Derek's transformation was yet to come. After weeks of spiritual purification, Derek reached what the voice called the final threshold, Sarah began, her hands clasped tightly together. All the supernatural correction, all the painful burning away of his spiritual corruption, had been preparation for one ultimate confrontation that would determine whether his redemption was genuine. The nature of this final test had been explained to them gradually. Derek would have to face the source of his original blasphemy, not just the anger and defiance that had motivated his challenge to God, but the deeper spiritual wounds that had made such rebellion possible in the first place. Derek had to confront the things that had broken him in Afghanistan, Sarah continued. The voice told us that his hatred of God hadn't really started with his father's death or even his addiction. It had begun on a battlefield when he witnessed things that made him question whether a loving God could exist. The confrontation wouldn't be a memory or vision, but a spiritual reality in which Derek would have to relive his most traumatic experiences while maintaining his newfound faith and humility. It was designed to test whether his transformation was deep enough to withstand the very circumstances that had originally destroyed his relationship with God. On a Thursday night in late August, Derek told me it was time, Sarah said. He'd been preparing through prayer and fasting, and he said he could feel the final test approaching. That night, Our living room became a battlefield between heaven and hell, with Derek's soul as the prize. The confrontation began around midnight, with Derek kneeling in the center of their living room just as he had during his ultimate confession weeks earlier. But this time, instead of confessing his sins, he was preparing to face the spiritual forces that had shaped his rebellion against God. The air in the room began to change, Sarah continued. Not the oppressive thickness we'd experienced during Derek's torment, but something that felt like the atmosphere before a massive thunderstorm, charged with potential energy and barely contained power. What manifested in their living room that night defied every category Sarah had for understanding reality. It wasn't a vision or hallucination, but an actual spiritual battleground where the forces of good and evil would contest for Derek's eternal soul. Derek suddenly went rigid, his eyes wide open, but clearly seeing something I couldn't perceive, Sarah said. Then he began to speak, but not to me. He was responding to someone or something that was making him relive his worst memories. Through Derek's responses, Sarah was able to piece together what he was experiencing. He was being forced to witness again the civilian casualties he'd caused in Afghanistan, the moments of moral compromise that had eaten away at his faith, and the gradual hardening of his heart that had made him vulnerable to spiritual corruption. But this time was different, Sarah explained. Instead of responding with anger and blame toward God, Derek was accepting responsibility for his choices. He was acknowledging that even in the worst circumstances, he'd had options other than rebellion. The spiritual forces testing Derek weren't content with passive acceptance of responsibility. They pushed him to defend his faith in the face of the same arguments that had originally destroyed it. The problem of evil, the suffering of innocence, the apparent silence of God in moments of desperate need. I watched Derek argue with invisible opponents for hours, Sarah said. But instead of the bitter, defiant arguments of his past, he was defending God's character while admitting his own limitations in understanding divine purposes. The most intense moment came when Derek was apparently confronted with a choice identical to the one that had originally broken his faith. Sarah couldn't see what he was experiencing, but she could hear his responses as he chose mercy over vengeance, faith over cynicism, and trust over control. Derek began to weep as he spoke to his invisible challengers, Sarah continued. But these weren't tears of defeat or anger, they were tears of gratitude. He was thanking God for loving him enough to discipline him, for not abandoning him even when he'd abandoned his faith. As Derek's responses demonstrated the genuineness of his transformation, the spiritual atmosphere in the room began to shift dramatically. The sense of impending judgment gave way to something that felt like celebration, as if heavenly forces were acknowledging Derek's successful completion of his redemptive journey. Then Derek said something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time, Sarah whispered. He looked up toward the ceiling and said, "God, I know I can never undo the damage I've done, but if you'll have me back, I want to spend whatever time I have left serving you and loving my wife the way she deserves to be loved." The response to Derek's declaration was immediate and overwhelming. A presence filled their living room that was so powerfully benevolent that Sarah fell to her knees, unable to remain standing in the face of such concentrated love and grace. A voice spoke, not the judgmental voice from Derek's confession or even the compassionate voice that had guided his redemption, but something that carried the weight of ultimate authority, Sarah said. And what it said completed Derek's transformation in a way that nothing else could have. The voice had formally accepted Derek's repentance and declared his spiritual debt fully paid. But more than that, it had restored him not just to his original state before his rebellion, but to a level of spiritual maturity he'd never previously achieved. Derek collapsed to the floor, but not from exhaustion or defeat, Sarah concluded. He was overwhelmed by the realization that he'd been forgiven completely, that his years of rebellion had been transformed into a testimony of God's redemptive power. The confrontation was over, but its effects would reshape every aspect of Derek and Sarah's life together. The man who emerged from that spiritual battlefield was someone entirely new, carrying the wisdom of someone who'd touched hell and chosen heaven. As Sarah approached the end of her extraordinary testimony, her voice took on a quality of profound peace that contrasted sharply with the trauma she'd been describing. It was as if recounting Derek's transformation had reminded her of the miraculous nature of what they'd experienced together. In the days following Derek's final confrontation, the pieces of our entire ordeal began falling into place in ways that revealed God's hand in every detail. Sarah began, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude rather than pain. What had seemed like random punishment and chaos was actually a carefully orchestrated plan for Derek's complete spiritual restoration. The supernatural manifestations that had plagued their home didn't disappear immediately, but their purpose became clear. Instead of tormenting Derek, they now served as confirmations of his transformation. The same forces that had once thrown objects in anger now seemed to be celebrating, creating displays of gentle movement that felt like divine applause. Derek woke up the morning after his final test completely changed, Sarah continued, not just spiritually, but physically. The hollow, haunted look that had consumed his features was replaced by something I can only describe as radiance. He looked like a man who'd been carrying an enormous weight and had finally been allowed to set it down. The first test of Derek's transformation came when he attempted to approach the burned remains of Sarah's Bible, which she'd kept in a small box as a reminder of that terrible night. For weeks, Derek hadn't been able to get within 10 feet of the destroyed book without experiencing violent physical reactions. Derek walked right up to the box and opened it without any problem, Sarah said, wonder still evident in her voice. He picked up the charred leather cover and held it against his chest, weeping with genuine remorse. Then he asked if we could bury it properly and buy a new Bible to replace it. Ooh, the trip to the Christian bookstore, the same one where Derek had collapsed weeks earlier, became a celebration of his complete restoration. Not only was he able to enter the building without difficulty, but the store manager who'd witnessed his earlier breakdown was amazed by the transformation in his appearance and demeanor. Derek bought not just one Bible, but 3, Sarah explained. One for our home, one for his truck, and one for his workplace. He said he never wanted to be in a situation again where he didn't have access to God's word. But the most remarkable confirmation of Derek's transformation came when he attempted something that had been impossible since his original blasphemy. He tried to pray aloud. The violent convulsions that had prevented any attempt at communication with God were completely gone, replaced by a fluency in prayer that surpassed even Sarah's own abilities. Derek's prayers weren't just requests or confessions, Sarah said. They were conversations with someone he clearly knew personally. It was like listening to a child talk to a beloved father after a long separation. The spiritual quarantine that had trapped Derek in their home was lifted completely. He was not only able to leave the house freely, but he felt compelled to visit the places where his journey had begun. His first stop was Murphy's Tavern, where he'd spent so many nights drowning his pain in alcohol. Derek walked into that bar and bought drinks for everyone there, Sarah continued. But instead of alcohol, he bought coffee and food, and he spent 3 hours telling anyone who would listen about what God had done in his life. The bartender, who'd served Derek countless drinks over the years, was so moved by his testimony that he asked Derek to pray with him. That night, 2 other men in the bar made decisions to seek help for their own addictions, inspired by the transformation they'd witnessed. Derek's story began spreading through our community like wildfire, Sarah said. People who'd known him before his transformation couldn't believe the change. Some thought he was putting on an act, but anyone who spent time with him could see that the change was real and permanent. The most powerful confirmation came when Derek decided to contact his former military unit. Many of his fellow soldiers had been struggling with their own spiritual battles, dealing with guilt and trauma from their service. Derek's testimony provided hope for men who'd given up on the possibility of redemption. Derek started a support group for veterans dealing with spiritual crisis, Sarah explained. He used his own experience of hitting rock bottom and finding God's grace to help other men who were fighting the same battles he'd once faced. But perhaps the most meaningful piece of the puzzle was the revelation of why Sarah had been chosen to witness Derek's entire ordeal. It wasn't coincidence or cruel circumstance. She'd been specifically prepared to serve as both witness and support during Derek's transformation. The voice that had guided us explained that Derek's redemption required not just his own faith, but the faith of someone who loved him enough to stand by him through the darkest valley. Sarah said, "My willingness to sacrifice myself for him, even after years of abuse, had provided the foundation of love that made his complete restoration possible." Derek's transformation had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond their marriage. Their pastor asked Derek to share his testimony with the congregation, leading to the largest series of altar calls in their church's history. People who'd been struggling with their own rebellions against God found hope in Derek's story of complete redemption. Everything that had seemed random and cruel during our ordeal revealed itself as part of a perfect plan, Sarah concluded. Derek's blasphemy, his supernatural punishment, his gradual redemption, and even my role in supporting him. It all fit together like pieces of a divine puzzle designed to demonstrate God's power to redeem even the most hopeless cases. The couple that had emerged from their supernatural trial was unrecognizable from the broken pair that had endured Derek's original challenge to God. They'd been forged in spiritual fire and emerged as living testimony to the reality of divine grace and the possibility of complete transformation. Marcus, what we experienced proved beyond any doubt that God is real, that spiritual forces are active in our world, and that no one is beyond the reach of divine love, Sarah said. But it also proved that redemption isn't cheap. It costs everything, but it's worth more than anything we could ever lose. Sarah took a deep breath as she prepared to share the final chapter of her remarkable journey. There was something different in her demeanor now. A sense of completion, as if telling this story had somehow brought full circle the healing that had begun months ago in her living room. The ultimate test of Derek's transformation came exactly 6 months after that terrible Friday night when he burned my Bible, Sarah began, her voice steady but filled with anticipation. We thought his redemption was complete, but God had one final lesson to teach us about the true nature of forgiveness and grace. The test came in the form of an unexpected visitor, Derek's father's brother, Uncle Raymond, who'd driven from 3 states away specifically to confront Derek about his recent transformation. Raymond was a bitter man who'd spent years enabling Derek's worst behaviors and encouraging his rebellion against authority, including divine authority. Raymond showed up at our door with a bottle of whiskey and a head full of poison, Sarah continued. He'd heard through family connections about Derek's dramatic change, and he was determined to prove it was all fake. He thought he could drag Derek back into his old patterns of behavior. What followed was a confrontation that would test every aspect of Derek's newfound faith and character. Raymond spent hours trying to provoke Derek, mocking his conversion, ridiculing his faith, and using every psychological weapon he'd accumulated over years of family dysfunction. Raymond said things that would have sent the old Derek into a violent rage, Sarah explained. He attacked Derek's manhood, his military service, his intelligence, and especially his faith. He called Derek weak, pathetic, and brainwashed. But Derek's response to this sustained assault was a demonstration of transformation so complete that even Sarah was amazed. Instead of anger or defensiveness, Derek showed genuine compassion for the pain that was driving his uncle's cruelty. Derek looked at Raymond with eyes full of love and said, "Uncle Ray, I know you're hurting. I know you've been angry at God for a long time, just like I was. But you don't have to carry that burden anymore, Sarah recounted, her voice filled with admiration. Raymond's reaction to Derek's compassion was to escalate his attacks, eventually challenging Derek to prove his faith by joining him in drinking and cursing God, essentially attempting to recreate the circumstances that had led to Derek's original downfall. Raymond opened that bottle of whiskey and poured 2 glasses, Sarah said. Then he raised his glass in a mock toast and said, "Here's to proving that God is a lie and your conversion is bullshit." He dared Derek to drink with him and curse God's name. The moment hung in the air like a sword suspended over Derek's soul. 6 months earlier, such a challenge would have been irresistible to him. The combination of alcohol, peer pressure, and rebellious invitation would have overcome any spiritual resistance he might have possessed. Derek stood up slowly and walked over to where Raymond was sitting, Sarah continued. I held my breath, wondering if this was the moment when all of Derek's progress would crumble. But what happened next proved that his transformation was real and permanent. Instead of taking the offered glass, Derek knelt down beside his uncle's chair and began to pray, not for himself, but for Raymond. He prayed for healing from whatever wounds had made Raymond so bitter, for forgiveness for all the pain Raymond was carrying, and for the same grace that had saved Derek to touch his uncle's heart. Raymond tried to interrupt Derek's prayer with curses and mockery, Sarah said, but Derek just kept praying, his voice growing stronger and more confident with each word. And gradually, something began to happen to Raymond. The change was subtle at first. Raymond's voice lost some of its edge, his posture became less aggressive, and tears began to form in his eyes. The sustained exposure to genuine love and prayer was having an effect that years of anger and bitterness couldn't resist. By the time Derek finished praying, Raymond was sobbing, Sarah continued. He threw the whiskey glass across the room, where it shattered against the wall, and he fell to his knees beside Derek, begging to know how he could find the same peace Derek had found. That night, their living room, the same space where Derek had committed his original blasphemy and later found his redemption, became the setting for another man's spiritual transformation. Raymond's conversion wasn't as dramatic as Derek's had been, but it was equally real and equally complete. Derek spent the entire night talking with Raymond about God's love, about forgiveness, about the possibility of starting over no matter how far you've fallen, Sarah said. By morning, Raymond was a different man. The bitterness that had defined him for decades was gone, replaced by hope and gratitude. The transformation of both men created a testimony so powerful that their story began spreading far beyond their small community. Churches, support groups, and counseling centers started inviting Derek to share his experience, turning his journey from blasphemy to redemption into a source of hope for countless others. Derek's final test had proven that his transformation wasn't just personal. It was equipped with the power to transform others, Sarah concluded. God hadn't just saved Derek, he'd turned him into an instrument of salvation for people who were trapped in the same spiritual darkness that had once consumed him. The decisive moment had passed, and Derek had proven beyond any doubt that his redemption was complete and authentic. But more than that, he demonstrated that true transformation has the power to break generational cycles of spiritual rebellion and bring healing to entire families. That night marked the beginning of a new phase of our lives, Sarah said, her eyes shining with joy. Derek wasn't just a man who'd been saved from hell, he was a man who'd been equipped to help others avoid the same fate. The story was nearing its end, but the most beautiful part was yet to come. The revelation of how Derek's complete transformation had restored not just his relationship with God, but his relationship with Sarah and their future together. Sarah's voice took on a quality of profound peace as she prepared to conclude her extraordinary testimony. The woman who had called me in terror just hours ago now radiated a joy that seemed to illuminate the entire diner. Marcus, as I finish telling you this incredible story, I want you to understand that Derek's transformation didn't just save his soul. It saved our marriage, our family, and gave us a future we never thought possible," Sarah began, her eyes bright with tears of gratitude. The Derek who emerged from his spiritual ordeal was not just a reformed version of the man Sarah had married. He was someone entirely new, carrying the wisdom of someone who'd experienced the depths of spiritual darkness and the heights of divine grace. Derek's love for me now isn't based on possession or control, but on genuine appreciation for the woman who stood by him through his darkest hour, Sarah continued. He treats me like the precious gift he now understands I am, and our relationship has become everything I'd prayed it could be during those long, painful years. The changes in Derek extended to every aspect of his character. The anger that had defined him for so long was replaced by patience. The pride that had led to his downfall was replaced by humility. The bitterness that had poisoned his relationships was replaced by forgiveness, both for others and for himself. Derek started each morning by asking God how he could serve our family and community that day, Sarah said. He became involved in veterans counseling, addiction recovery programs, and marriage restoration ministries. His life became a living testimony to the power of complete redemption. 6 months after Derek's final test, Sarah discovered she was pregnant, a blessing that had eluded them throughout their troubled marriage. At age 38, after years of believing she'd never be a mother, Sarah was carrying the child she'd always dreamed of having. "Derek wept when I told him about the baby," Sarah said, her voice filled with wonder. "He said it felt like God's way of saying our future could be completely different from our past. We'd been given not just redemption, but renewal." The pregnancy became a symbol of their transformed life together. Derek attended every doctor's appointment, read every parenting book he could find, and spent hours talking to their unborn child about the God who had saved their family. Our daughter was born on the first anniversary of Derek's final confrontation, Sarah concluded, her voice breaking with emotion. "We named her Grace because that's what saved us all." Derek held her in his arms and promised her that she would grow up knowing only the father God had made him into, not the man he used to be. Derek's testimony continued to impact lives throughout their community and beyond. He'd become a sought-after speaker at churches, rehabilitation centers, and military support groups. His story provided hope for marriages that seemed beyond repair and individuals who believed they were beyond redemption. "People travel from hundreds of miles away to hear Derek speak," Sarah said. "Not because he's a great orator, but because his life proves that no one is too far gone for God's grace to reach them. His transformation gives hope to the hopeless." The couple's home, which had once been a battleground between heaven and hell, became a place of healing and restoration. They opened their doors to other couples struggling with addiction, spiritual crisis, and marital problems, providing living proof that complete transformation was possible. As Sarah concluded her remarkable testimony, she looked at me with eyes that had witnessed the impossible and emerged stronger for the experience. "Marcus, I called you tonight because I needed someone to hear this story, to know that miracles still happen in our world. Derek's redemption wasn't just about saving one man's soul, it was about demonstrating God's power to transform any life, no matter how broken. The woman sitting across from me, was no longer the terrified, shattered person who'd called at 3:47 a.m. She was a living witness to the reality of divine grace, a testament to the power of love that refuses to give up, and proof that even the darkest night can give way to the brightest dawn. Derek often says that his blasphemy was the worst thing he ever did, but it led to the best thing that ever happened to him, Sarah concluded. He had to lose everything, his pride, his rebellion, his false independence, to gain everything that truly matters: peace with God, genuine love for his family, and a purpose worth living for. As I drove home through the quiet streets of our small town, I carried with me a story that had fundamentally changed my understanding of faith, redemption, and the power of divine love. Sarah's testimony proved that no challenge to God goes unanswered, no genuine repentance goes unrewarded, and no love offered in faith goes unnoticed by heaven. Derek's journey from blasphemy to redemption had become a beacon of hope for anyone who believes they've gone too far to find their way back home.